Hello, musicians! Welcome to another episode of Explore Great Music with Ted. Today, we'll study the score of the third movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony. We'll remark on its scherzo trio form, notice the persistent returns of its opening motifs, and see that its distinctive color is produced by simple changes of orchestration. And in a first on this channel, there will be a pop quiz at the end. So with that, let's explore the score. Let's begin our study of the third movement by noting some changes in the orchestration. Dvorak has left out the trombones and tuba and added the triangle. This movement is a particular kind of ternary form called a scherzo trio. The introduction begins in E minor, with a succession of descending perfect fourths that lead to the stacked perfect fifths in the strings, forming a 1-7 chord. The A section proper begins on the next page. The flute and oboe have the A melody, which consists of two 4-measure phrases, little a and little a. Little a can be further decomposed into two 2-measure motifs, X and Y. Note that Dvorak doubles the oboe with the second flute, again distributing solos between both flute players. Importantly, also notice that the clarinet imitates the A melody at the distance of 1 measure. Next, the A theme is picked up by the first violins. At first glance, we might think that the imitation has disappeared, but upon closer look, we see that the imitation moved to the timpani. When the A prime phrase completes, there is a 2-measure bridge in the strings that connects to the B phrase. Thunderclaps in the timpani mark the beginning of each of two 4-measure phrases, little b and little b. A double prime is taken up by the violins in the highest register, while the upper winds follow with the imitation 1 measure behind. There is also a new counter melody in the horns, marked H. It features a favorite device of Dvorak in his symphonic scherzos, hemiola. A double prime repeats, now with the A phrase in the cello's basses, third and fourth horns. The hemiola counter melody is now picked up by the winds. The A section completes with phrase C, which is 4 measures repeating the Y motif. Then the entire section repeats. Following the repeat of section A, there is a bridge to section B of the scherzo. It begins in E minor with repetitions of the Y motif in the strings, and then continued by the solo bassoon. The strings now take up the accompaniment pattern of repeated 1-5-7 in each measure. Notice Dvorak's choice of notation, 8th note, 16th note. The last measure of the bridge moves to the parallel major, and this introduces the B section of the scherzo. The B melody, played by the oboe and first flute, begins with a rising minor third, an inversion of the Y motif continued in the bassoon. The B melody repeats in the clarinets an octave apart. Dvorak adds the triangle to the accompaniment here. The B melody is ternary. Its B phrase is played by the flutes and oboes and thirds an octave apart. This passage is also an excursion to the subdominant, A major. The A prime phrase returns in the cellos, doubled by the bassoons in E major, again with 1-5-7 chords in each measure. The percussion accompaniment becomes a little more elaborate, with the timpani playing 1-5 on beats 1 and 3, and the triangle and trumpets playing on beat 2. Of particular note here is the truncation of the A melody in the cellos by 1 measure. The A section of the scherzo returns, now in E major. The A melody is played by the first violins with imitation by the timpani. Also note here that the string accompaniment is the stacked fifths. The violins then perseverate on the X motif, imitated by the trumpets. At this point, the orchestra rushes headlong chromatically upward, reaching a dominant seventh of E. Upon reaching the dominant seventh, Dvorak brings back P1A from the first movement in the cellos, basses, third and fourth horns. This is a rare appearance in this symphony of the harmonic minor. Now, in full tutti and E minor, the A melody is in the violins and the rhythmic imitation in the trumpets. The cellos, basses, and horns play the hemiola countermelody. The scherzo comes to a dramatic conclusion where the violins perseverate on the Y motif, fragmenting it and finally hammering it twice. The cadences in this passage are 2 diminished 6/5 to 1. What follows next is a bridge to the trio. The winds play a succession of 6/1 cadences while the strings toss the X motif down, landing in the violas and cellos. On the next page, the cellos play P1A from the first movement, and notice how this morphs into motif W. Then motif W is passed immediately from the flute to the clarinet to the violas, and finally second violins, where it lands on A-flat minor, a major third away from E minor. Next, it is the turn of the violas to play P1A, and this is followed by motif W, cascading from the flute to the oboe to the first violins in C minor, again a major third from A-flat minor. The first violins immediately switch to C major, and the W motif becomes the ostinato figure that accompanies the upcoming melody. This truly Schubertian melody is the core of the A section of the trio. Throughout the trio, we will encounter figures in the background, such as here, where the triangle and timpani are supported by the cellos and basses. The C melody completes on the next page. Moving on to the B section of the trio, melody D is in the violins. Notice that it is composed of alternating motifs J and K. These will become important shortly. The A phrase of D is repeated by the winds and modulates to E minor. The B phrase follows with motifs J and K in the first violins and then repeated in E major by the second violins. Phrase C devolves to repetitions of motif K only. Trilling figures on K alternate between the strings and winds. The first 4 measures are in the major mediant of C major, that is, an E major chord. And the second 4 measures are in the supertonic of C, D minor chord. The A section of the trio then returns in C major. Here, the orchestration is more elaborate still. There are new ostinato figures in the strings and new patterns in the timpani and the triangle. Upon completion of the trio, there is a brief 9-measure bridge back to the scherzo. Reminiscent of a passage in the second A section of the scherzo, Dvorak uses fragment X to quickly move chromatically upward here from C minor back to the key of the scherzo, E minor. The coda begins on a C major chord that could be interpreted as a 5-4-2 of F major. The third and fourth horns play P1A from the first movement, while the oboe and second flute follow with the X motif twice. The C major 7th chord resolves to D flat major, perhaps flat 6 of F major. The first and second horns play P1A and C sharp major, again followed by the X motif in the oboe and flute. C sharp major takes on the character of a 5-6-4 of F sharp minor, which arrives 8 measures later as P1A again in the first and second horns. The winds and horns repeat P1A in F sharp minor and build up to a dominant of E minor. This resolves to E major, the beginning of section 2 of the coda. The trumpets enter triumphantly with S2A from the first movement, accompanied by the X motif in the violins. The X motif continues to repeat in the strings and begins to disintegrate, even while the timpani yet again imitates the violins with the X motif. On the trumpet's arrival on the last note of S2A, the harmony switches back to the parallel minor and remains in E minor to the end. As the X motif continues to disintegrate, the violas play a written-out Decellerando. The movement concludes with a bang. Well, musicians, there you have it. We've just concluded our deep dive into the score of the third movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony. We've seen that it is a scherzo trio scherzo with extended bridge passages between sections. It concludes with a rousing coda, where motifs from the scherzo are combined with themes from the first movement. We also notice the distinctive color produced by adding the triangle and subtracting trombones and tuba. As always, I'd love to hear from you, so please leave your thoughts and questions. Oops, I almost forgot. It's time for a pop quiz. Do you remember in the coda the dramatic reappearance of the first movement's second secondary theme? Well, just before that, there is a big build-up in the entire orchestra. Question is, what is this chord? If you said, it's a first-class French augmented sixth chord, you get an A. Now, for extra credit, can you think of an equally famous symphony by a different composer where this chord also appears? That's right. There it is at the beginning of the last movement of the Fourth Symphony by Johannes Brahms, and in the same key, no less. As always, I'd love to hear from you, so please leave your thoughts and questions in the comments section. If you found the annotations helpful and enjoyed the commentary, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye for now.